Hello and welcome to the Amtgard V9 Committee 2022 Annual Report. I'm Heron.
I'm Goravan.
I'm Cord.
I'm Manama.
And I'm Winjo.
During this presentation, I'll be covering a bit of what we've been up to since our 2021 Annual Report. We'll hear from Goravan about what we've learned this past year, from Cord and Winjo about our plans for the coming year, and then from Manama about the rules change process and why a new version is so important. This past year, we've put a lot of effort into gathering information. We put out 15 surveys, including one for each class, as well as a general survey covering every class at once. We're aware that these surveys won't reach everyone and gather every opinion, but with as many responses as we got, we're pretty confident in that data. We also implemented something called the Field Research Program, which was a method for testing out some important concepts that have come up via our continuing focus groups. This program involved over 50 parks and 6 experiments. The research prompts weren't meant to be used outright in a final V9 build, but rather helped us build the alpha on stable ground by answering some important design questions. With an alpha rule set underway, we're excited to move into actual playtesting in the coming year. We've also stayed connected with the org team, the executive committee, and Amtgard International. For our surveys, we set ourselves a goal of 100 responses to each class survey, as well as the number of responses from each kingdom proportional to its size. For the most part, we succeeded. There are some classes with fewer responses, like Paladin and Anti-Paladin, that had been available only recently, and some classes with a lot more, like Barbarian. We asked people all sorts of questions in each survey, ranging from how effective they thought a class was, to how well the rules supported the theme of the class. We decided to ask participants to identify whether they considered themselves particularly skilled at a class, and which ones they considered to be their mains. The folks who are most passionate about a class tend to play it a lot, and they're likely to know its ins and outs. All this data helped inform some points that Goravan will go into more detail about later. Our survey data also shows that confidence in the V9 project has remained fairly steady over the last year, dipping slightly from 70% to about 68%. This is pretty expected. With all the time we've spent researching and collecting data, there's been plenty of opportunity for speculation and anxiety to build. We've received more than a few messages from folks who think that we're responsible for ongoing V8 rules change proposals, as well as a few concerning totally homebrew playtests. You would not believe the things I've been told are happening in V9. This confusion's a bit inevitable with how widespread Amtgard is and how visible our team is. That said, we're now finishing Phase 2 of development, which means we're beginning to make real decisions and build an alpha rule set that will give people a more concrete look at the direction of V9. This should help put speculation to rest and give us a clearer idea of what people think about the project. The majority of Amtgard is confident in our work, which is really encouraging for us. Next up, Goravan's going to talk a little bit about what we've learned about V8 this last year.
Thanks, Heron. Hi all, Goravan here to talk to you about where we're at. This section will cover some of the data we've gathered on the state of V8 since last GOTC, as well as some auxiliary data gathered from the org. First off, let's talk about the class surveys. We asked about each one individually, as well as all the classes as a whole. By asking respondents to give their ratings based on a variety of factors, we were able to compile tier lists of which classes were strongest and weakest in each area and overall. Some of the categories we asked people to rate were more straightforward, such as ability to deal damage or work with teammates, while others were subjective factors, like how much a class's appeal comes from its theming and flavor, or from the mechanics the class uses. The caster classes were our frontrunners, though not exclusively. Every class except Druid appeared in the bottom 3 at least once, and poor Barbarian came in the bottom 3 the most. As a note, our data on Paladin and Anti-Paladin was collected after the limitations on those classes were relaxed, but before the populace had a significant amount of playtime under their belt, so take that data with a grain of salt. For the class surveys, we also asked people to self-report whether they consider themselves skilled or mains for each class, and while they tended to match the general populace in their opinions, they across the board rated their own classes extremely highly in attractiveness of theme and attractiveness of mechanics. I'm glad people are playing classes they like. You know what else people like? Magic. Next up, we'll cover magic and abilities. We established an overall list of every ability in V8 and gave each a score based on how respondents feel when playing with or against that ability. Factors included fairness and enjoyment, as well as frustration and discouragement. At the top of the list, we have Mend, Release, Force Bolt, Fireball, and Heal. On the other end of the spectrum are Finger of Death, Golem, Gift of Air, Icy Blast, and in dead last, Ice Ball. We saw that the abilities that ranked the highest had simpler effects independent of how strong they were. Additionally, abilities with complicated or unique effects tended to rank lower, as did those with more oppressive control states. Another type of negative experience that cropped up is the frustration of having to explain some of the more complex enchantments, such as Golem, Undead Minion, and Gift of Air. Lastly, while players certainly enjoy Amtgard's more powerful abilities, these tended to rank lower due to the negative experiences they often imparted on their targets. Changing tacks a little bit. Here we have some data extracted from the orc by the wonderful Kismet, showing player lifespans and the overall population size of Amtgard. Our takeaways here are that the player base peaked in 2016 and has been declining since then, even when looking solely at pre-pandemic numbers. We believe that the release of V9 will provide a boost to growth and retention, counteracting our current decline and ensuring the future of Amtgard. Speaking of the future, please join me in welcoming Cord and Wunjo, who are going to talk a little bit about where we're going.
Thanks, Goravan. Hi, everyone. I'm Cord. Not only am I a member of the V9 team, but I also had the privilege of being one of the writers of the V8 rules of play. That experience allows me to provide insight into many of the design decisions that were made in V8, as well as some of the mistakes that we now have the opportunity to correct in V9. So I know the burning question on everyone's mind is this: what is the V9 committee planning to do with the new version? When the V8 team was writing the rules, there were a number of concepts that we introduced that the current team plans to either maintain or expand upon. Let's look at a few of those now. First, the core combat rules. The core combat rules will remain largely the same as what you're familiar with in V8. While there may be some minor updates and clarifications, ultimately you can expect the same fast-paced combat you've come to know and love. Next, weapon construction. Much of the feedback that we've received about weapon construction was related to weapon safety. As such, we're committing to improve weapon safety, with both archery and great weapon safety at the top of the list. Now, on to one of the more contentious topics, armor. Given the breadth of opinion and feedback we've received, there's a lot about armor that's still on the table. However, there are a few things that we are committing to. First, we will be retaining a multi-point rating system and segmented armor values. However, we will be making the armor construction rules more forgiving than what they are in V8, as well as making it at least somewhat easier to get class max values for all classes. Now, moving on to spells and abilities. V8 introduced the concept of states and removed multiple instances of the same or similar effects and consolidated many of them together. We're committing to continuing the use of states in V9 and to further expand the number of states and standardized common effects. One of the goals of V8 was to revise confusing and overly complex mechanics. Our plan is to carry this concept forward into V9 to help streamline play and make the rules easier to understand. V8 also removed numerous problem spells and effects. We will again continue this trend by removing or updating such spells and effects to more enjoyable versions. Of particular note, we will be reworking all physical touch requirements for verbal spells and enchantments. We're also iterating on V8's magic system to further improve understanding and execution on the battlefield. This will include things like streamlining and simplifying incantations, reducing exceptions to the rule, and providing intuitive and clear rules text. Our goal with this is to decrease the amount of time people spend learning or debating the rules, and increase the amount of time people spend actually playing them. Now that we've reviewed some of the things we'll be retaining and enhancing, Wunjo will review some of the new concepts that we'll be introducing in V9. Wunjo, take it away.
Thanks, Cord. Hi, folks. I'm Wunjo, and I'm the current director of the Amtgard V9 project. Whereas Cord went over some of the ways we intend to iterate and expand on the V8 rules, I'm going to take you through how we plan to make version 9 feel fresh and exciting. Now, to be perfectly clear, this is not a complete list. Rather, it's a peek at some of the things we feel comfortable committing to at this time. Let's take a look. First up, we have enchantments, or to be more accurate, the enchantment ecosystem. Players love buffs, but V8 went a little overboard with the quality and quantity of enchantments. This has made enchantments the go-to solution for almost every situation in V8, and that explosion of usage has exposed a lot of flaws in the system. Namely, the ways we display, declare, and deal with enchantments. As such, in Amtgard V9, we will be reworking the visual and auditory indicators, as well as reducing the overall impact of enchantments on our everyday games, putting specific effort into balancing their effect on park-sized games and games where the participants care more about playing the classes they like than the classes that are strategically optimal. Speaking of classes, let's talk about everyone's favorite aspect of Amtgard. You've all been asking for it, so now we're committing to it. In Amtgard V9, all classes will have some form of customization and archetypes. The martial classes will finally be unshackled from their static ability lists for the first time in Amtgard history. And, with how casters have dominated the V8 metagame, we hope we can use this as a way to narrow the power gap between the martial and caster classes, if not eliminate it entirely. Further, we want to give our players the ability to explore, experiment, and discover that perfect class identity, or identities, as soon as possible. As such, we are also committing to further reducing the time to level so that folks can spend more time playing the game as it was meant to be played and less time stuck in the grind. Now, if we're going to talk about the way things were meant to be played, how about putting some RP back into our LARP? The Amtgard V9 team is committing to add a fleshed-out roleplay system to the rules of play. This optional rules layer will function much like how Ditch, Militia, and full-class rules all build upon each other while still allowing our game organizers to pick the rules that are right for their activity. New and updated roleplay abilities are a shoo-in, and we will be actively exploring methods to address the desire for character-based progression and long-term storytelling tools in a way that works for the niche that Amtgard occupies. At this time, I'd like to mention that as we develop all these new rules, we'll be keeping a critical eye on the overall complexity, the learning curve, and the new player experience. Likewise, as Amtgard has grown over the years, so too has the diversity and desires of our active player base. The V9 team is committing to expand the explicit scope of our game so that it encompasses all those that have made Amtgard a part of their lives, as well as to attract new players who may have their primary interest in our non-combat offerings. While class battle gaming will undoubtedly remain our flagship attraction, we want to make space in our rulebook to legitimize the wide variety of non-fighting activities that form the pillars of this community that holds battle gaming at its core. Last but not least, let's talk about official support for monsters and game organizers. In Amtgard V9, the door on Avatar will be designed in-house with the explicit intent to synergize with the core rules of play, making combat with monsters an enjoyable experience for everyone, not just the monster. Further, the V9 team is committing to a third official supporting document, the Game Organizer Guide, or GOG for short. The GOG will be our equivalent to the Dungeon Master's Guide, a supporting document for game designers, reeves, and roleplay organizers. Notably, this document won't contain any actual rules. Rather, it will help us remove bloat from the core rulebook by giving us a space just for our facilitators. A space where we can flesh out the guidance and examples they need, and continue to support those who choose to step up and ensure we've all got something to do week after week. Before I pass things over to Manama, I'd like to quickly go over our current projected timeline for the rest of V9 development. In a nutshell, we are still on track for a 2024 release if approved. Over the next year, we will be launching our alpha rule set to a closed audience, the members of our field research program. Once we are comfortable with the results of the alpha, we will be opening up beta playtesting to anyone who wants to participate. If everything goes well with the beta, we will present our final rule set to the Interkingdom Circle of Monarchs for an official vote in summer 2024. If the vote passes and V9 is adopted, we intend to spend 2025 providing post-launch care and addressing any major issues that may have slipped through the cracks, after which point we will hand the reins back to the official rules revision process. Speaking of the rules revision process, some folks have been asking us why we don't make all these changes with the current rules revision process. Why V9? To answer that, I'm going to throw you over to the current RRO and head of V8, Manema.
Thanks, Wunjo. Hi, I'm Manema, and I'm the current V8 Rules Representative Organizer. So why version 9? Why are we going to a new edition? These are questions that I have heard quite often, and it's something that needs an answer. What I'm going to go over is some things to keep in mind when we're talking about going to a new version as opposed to something like the rules rep process to do changes themselves. So when it comes to the rules rep process, we have this right now on a yearly basis, and the problem with that is that they're looking at piecemeal changes. I want to change this section. If you try to write one rules rep to write, I want to change like this entire class structure. I want to add archetypes to all melee classes. That is something that's going to be really hard for them to develop as well as sell to the other 21 representatives. You have a lot of problems with compromise. You have a lot of problems with direction. You have a lot of problems with representation even because people put their idea out there, they try to get it heard, no one else likes their idea, and then that person decides, well, I guess I'm not in the right group, and they're not contributing anymore. And then some people end up dominating in the end anyways, but then it might not be the people that are actually doing the good designing, it's just the people with the loudest voices in the room. Really, it's about too many cooks. Right? You have to, at some point, cut it off to a smaller group of actual designers that have goals. They have a list of tenets that they're supposed to be kind of abiding by. This is that kind of things that really streamlines this process and makes it easier to do, along with still using things like the rules reps and other people to bounce off feedback and to get information from, so that we're not just contained in like a bubble. These group of people are the ones we're going to trust to go forward with the design decisions, knowing that whatever they come up with is not going to have a perfect answer, but they at least have had a focus and a goal so that their answer is leading us towards what is hopefully the best answer. Another thing to think about is the emotional response of the public in the Circle of Monarchs. A new edition primes people's expectations for how much can change. If you do small changes, obviously the rules rep process is good for that. But when you're looking at systematic changes, people don't expect those changes to happen in piecemeal. They often want to make sure that the balance is all good. And if you try to do that in the rules representative process, you're going to run into some emotionally charged problems with how the public views those changes. Whereas if you have a new version of the rules saying, hey, all these things changed at once, it's much easier to manage people's expectations as well as get good feedback for those playtests. So, to sum it all up, given my position as the rules rep organizer and as a member of the Amtgard V9 committee, I strongly believe that the current V8 rules revision process is insufficient for the scope of change that is being sought by our players. A new edition, helmed by a small group of dedicated designers, has the best odds of producing an outcome that not only addresses the needs of our members, but effectively manages game balance, player enjoyment, and future growth. It's clear to me that the question we should really be asking isn't why V9, but why not V9? Thank you.
Well, that wraps up our 2022 annual report. For anyone looking for more information on the V9 project, documents can be found on amtgard.com/V9 or on our Facebook page, Amtgard V9. Thank you all so much for your time, and we're looking forward to sharing our progress over the coming year. So long!